Welcome everybody. Good afternoon on this webinar where I sit down together with James Pearson with the title Real Life Experience with Test Automation. It's based on a presentation we did at the Days of Knowledge in Birmingham last March where we were updating each other, and today it's partly a repeat but partly also a new update to each other. So welcome James for stepping in with me for today. Let's always, but before we really start, sorry to interfere, some of the standard slides, like the housekeeping rules. We're very happy that you're all here. As you might know, your microphone is muted, stays muted, but feel free to pose any questions in the question window, where we will both have a look at and keep an eye on and pick them up as soon as we get time or make sense to answer the question. So be invited to do that. Don't hold back. As always, I'll do my best somewhere just before dinner or after dinner to get the recording pushed to YouTube, and always take some time because I'm adding this index, so it might take a little bit more than that. But be free to use it, and of course, if you're not yet subscribed to our newsletter, please do so to get informed. As you might know, if you're subscribed, I just sent out last week a new newsletter as I set up a new session myself again with David Singleton because of a topic we were discussing, and recently getting more questions. Well, it's not new, but getting more relevant questions of partners wanting to talk about how about customer projects, more or less, as you can say with the with the exclamation mark, you can't sell test automation to customer projects. And I'll sit down with David to discuss that. Be welcome to join us in 2 weeks. So as always, still looking for speakers, so be welcome also to send in your topics or send in your own suggestion of being a speaker on a certain topic. I'm more than willing to provide you the platform to do that. So, and before we're going to take off, James, let me thank Fornaf again for sponsoring us, making us able to do this. So let's get into our part, James. So a small introduction to yourself, and I'll do a small introduction to mine. So James, just a few words on yourself.
Okay, hello everybody, thanks for joining. I am the development lead for Drinkit. We are making ISV for the beverage industry, and one of my particular areas of interest, along with Luc for a while now, has been automated testing, especially building that into the development experience in VS Code, and how we make that a practical and useful discipline as part of our everyday life.
We've been walking this road parallel, crossing each other once in a while, like today. And yes, James has been a very good peer to me, as you have been the reviewer of the first edition of my book, and we have been discussing some things a long while and going our own road, like you started to develop the AL test runner and doing your things. And that's typically what we're going to share with you. What are we doing currently with test automation? And this is what we'll do today. That's the agenda. James is updating me, I'm updating James, and we might go up and down. We've got a couple of slides, or a number of slides for each of us. Probably we do it sequentially, but we might jump from one to the other or back from one to the other again.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm not going to spend long on this because I'm guessing anyone who's attending this webinar is already invested to some extent in why we would be interested in automated testing. But I think it's interesting because Luc and I are coming from slightly different perspectives. So as a developer who's writing tests, from my perspective, why is it something that's interesting for us? Would you do it because someone at a conference told you it was a best practice? Yeah, there's lots of things which are recommended as best practices. Use Docker, use source control, use DevOps or GitHub, or all sorts of things. To my mind, that's not a good enough reason. You can't just adopt disciplines because someone has told you it's a best practice. And similarly, should you do it because your boss says that you have to, or your team says that it's something you have to do? Well, that's fine if you're maybe a junior developer just getting started with Business Central. Of course, it's fine for people to tell you, this is a discipline we have, you need to follow it. But at some point, I think you have to be a bit more invested in the development practices and why you're following them. So why is automated testing a good thing? Because if you don't understand why you're doing it, then the tests that you write probably aren't going to be as useful as they could be. Well, what about, well, I'm just so passionate about Business Central development. Good luck trying to sell that to your project manager or to your team lead if you have to fill in timesheets. Why have you spent twice as long on this development? Well, it's just because I'm so passionate about Business Central development. That's not going to fly either. What is the solid reason that we would invest our time in writing tests in addition to the new functionality or the change requests that we are writing for our customers? And the only reason that makes any sense to me is you are personally convinced that the code that you are going to deliver into your products or to your customer is better for following this practice. At the end of the day, that's all that we care about. What is the quality of the code that we're shipping, and do the practices that we follow actually help that quality at the end of the day? So for me, the most useful thing about automated testing isn't actually to do with the code and running tests and pipelines. It's more of a mindset change, that it forces me to focus on what is the expected behavior of this work item, this change request that I'm working on. How will I know when it works the way that it's supposed to? Or how will I know when it is not working the way that it's supposed to? And you may be familiar with breaking your requirements into given, when, and then statements. I think Luc's going to talk about that a bit more.
Sure. Yep.
If I can't summarize the functionality into those statements, given something is true, when this happens, then this is the expected result, then realistically, I don't know what the expected behavior is. And so can I really start coding when I don't know what I'm expecting the outcome to be? And, hands up, we've probably all started some development like that at one point, where we don't actually know what the customer or the consultant really wants, but we have to start doing something. So we make a start only to find this wasn't quite what the customer was expecting at the end. And then an additional benefit is, if you start writing your feature code with testability in mind, it is going to be just naturally better separated, the idea of separation of concerns. It is going to be more modular, easier to read and understand, and therefore to change and maintain, because it will stop you from writing an enormous code unit with a local procedure right in the middle, which you can't get at to test. If you're thinking about how am I going to test this up front, then your code will have to be more separated and easier to maintain than that. So this is how I'm working day to day and what I'm thinking about. I'm typically working in a local Docker container, and I will publish as many of our apps that are relevant to the scenario I'm developing Of course, I have the BC container helper PowerShell module, and then AL language, my AL test runner extension in Visual Studio Code. I normally use Code Insiders just because I'm interested in what's coming next in VS Code.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm normally working in a multi-root workspace with the production app and then the test app, two separate apps side by side. And my goal is that I can run my tests in an empty company. I typically try to avoid being too dependent on, I need some Cronus demo data, or I need to have imported a rapid start configuration package. Of course, that is more effort up front if I have to create all of the data that I need for my test. But again, I find that a useful discipline because it forces me to actually understand the standard Business Central logic as well. If I need, let's say, a production order with some components and some routing as part of my test, then I need to know, well, how do I actually set that up in my test? I'm going to need a work center or a machine center. Maybe I need to have populated the shop floor calendar. I'm going to need to create a BOM and a routing. And it forces me, even though I'm not a consultant, typically I'm not in a customer-facing role, it forces me to at least have a level of understanding of the manufacturing module, in this example, that I can actually go and create my test, which I think is not a bad thing as a developer. Yeah, sorry, Luke.
Yeah, don't you use any of the standard libraries of Microsoft because of that to achieve that you have an empty company, or do you use and accept that you do have some data needed in Cronus or whatever?
Yes, using the Microsoft libraries, yeah, definitely. So the library manufacturing code unit to create some of this master data. But not already relying on, well, my Cronus data has a work center 10 already set up, so I can just get data that I rely on already existing. So yes, creating them with a library, but without depending on them already being in the company. Let me switch to Visual Studio Code. Here we go. So my scenario in this case is I've got an app called Order Origin where we want to record the origin of our sales orders. Have they come in from the website or EDI? Has a salesperson brought the order in? Very simple. We've just got an order entry table where we have code and description, and we can set an order origin code on the customer table, and that should flow to the documents that we create for that customer. I like to work with side-by-side editors like this. So I usually have my, just lose that for a second. I usually have my production code on the left and my test code on the right. It's just a useful visual reminder to myself, don't neglect this code on the right. So normally I would start with, so let's say, okay, I have an example here. The order origin is copied from a customer record to a sales order. So typically I'd be creating my, oh, come on, my test procedure first. Order origin is copied from customer to sales order to, and then I'll be going to fill in my given when then. And it may be that at this point I realize I'm not sure what to write for these comments. And that might be the point I need to go back to the consultant or the customer and say, actually, what are you expecting in this case? What if it's not an order? What if it's a return order or a blanket order? Maybe we need to clarify what actually are the requirements here. And then I would finish the test. It may be, of course, you have to write some code in the production app just to make the test compile. Maybe you need to create new fields, a new code unit with a method that you can call. I do the minimum on the left that I can so that I can actually run the test. And I want to see the test fail. And that's really important, because if I never see the test fail, it doesn't give me confidence that when it passes, that's because the test actually works. It may be that I've made a mistake in the test, and actually the test always passes, regardless of whether my code is correct or not. In which case, the test is useless, or actually a bit less than useless, because it tells me the code works when in fact it doesn't work. So I want to make sure this test does fail first, for the reason I'm expecting it to fail, because I need to fix a bug, I need to write some new feature, and then I'll come onto the left, write my code, and then I want to see the test pass afterwards.
So this is very near to the test-driven development paradigm of red-green refactor, and so you.
Yeah. I wouldn't be very strict about doing the test first. That's my preference. But there are some cases where you may want to fill in the tests afterwards. But where possible, I try to write the test first, and then you have the confidence of, yeah, this is a scenario which did not work, and I wrote my code, and now it does work.
Clear.
Does that look familiar to you, Luc? Is that typically how you're thinking about?
It relates a lot, but typically your let's say you take the developer's perspective, as you said in your introduction. You want to guarantee the quality of your code, and it relates a lot, but I'll elaborate on that later, of course, a bit more. It relates a lot where you said, I want to know, to understand the expected behavior. Yeah? And let's say you're sitting here more or less, we're mimicking a little bit, you're sitting here with your small demo as a developer. I need to have this scenario now in. Do I understand it well enough? So it's a kind of iterative process, if I may say so, having a scenario and a next scenario and getting nearer and nearer to completion of the full requirement.
Yeah.
Clear to me.
Okay. So there's a question that I wanted to ask you, which is, what's your view on, are there things that you would not test? So if any of the folks on the webinar were at Birmingham for the Days of Knowledge, I shared at the time I would be going out to do some training with some of my colleagues, and this was a question that came up. We did that training 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, perhaps, and we were thinking about how much of the system are we trying to test? Are there things that just do not belong in an automated test? You got a view on that?
Yeah. Do you want me to provide you some answers, and then I'll hear your side?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, a technical restriction for me is for sure that we're not going to test any external systems. So we're focusing on BC, the BC logic. So if we're calling upon an external system, and that could even be being the connection we make with our own outside apps, it doesn't need to be a service of a third party, but could even be our own services. We don't want to test that directly. There is something like that might be the case in the future when we get a better hold on it, but in general, testing a web service call, the call itself is not what we want to do. That's a typical one. And then the next thing is also, and that's a bit a gray area, but let's say as soon as it at the moment, as soon as it becomes too difficult to achieve in code, we allow ourselves to say, okay, can we do it manually? And we will do it manually. That's roughly the two things at the moment with at 4PS, where I'm currently running a big project. Let's say those two rough rules.
Yep, makes sense. So my answers, which are probably similar to yours actually, I tend to avoid trying to test code that's written on pages. So on have to get records, the code behind actions. I mean the actual on action trigger. Of course, if that calls a code unit with some business logic, we'll test the code unit or maybe the table methods. But the code on the page itself, I try to avoid using test page variables for a couple of reasons, because they're a bit slower to run than pure code tests, and also you can't debug them with my extension for reasons we don't need to go into. But so that makes it a bit. You have to then go into the Business Central client to debug them if you want to debug the test that's based on a page as well. So I try to avoid that. Like you say, web service calls is not our problem. I won't test the actual HTTP client code that is sending the request. I will test if I'm expecting, let's say, a JSON response in a particular structure. I'll have a library code unit which creates JSON in the sort of structure we're expecting, and then I'll pass that directly to the business logic, which is going to handle it, rather than making an actual web service call.
Yeah, makes full sense.
I don't know what you think about this. I know you've blogged and you've written a bit about how to test your Business Central APIs.
Yeah.
It's not something that I tend to test. Again, because if there's a significant amount of business logic, I would separate that into a code unit and run the tests in there. But maybe you have a different approach to APIs.
That relates a bit also to your first bullet point here. And so, or actually, was on your first slide, I think, that you split the how do you call it, the point of interest. So you split up your code, you write testable code, and split your business logic from the points where it's called from. Like on the pages, you shouldn't write your implementation in the action. It should have been a separate method which you can call all the business logic in your test. And similar with the API calls, although I haven't been working on it that way at the moment at 4PS, we don't do a lot on API tests from coded tests, but it's done manually at the moment mostly. On the other hand, let's say the experience I have, it is not too difficult, and yes, you could just check the business logic. On the other hand, as it's your API, calling upon that API through your own test code, and yes, as I said, it's not too difficult, and it's not as slow as calling up on pages. It's quite fast. I would choose to do it, but it's also about where are you going to gain the most from putting effort in getting test automation in place. And yes, then I would agree if you have separated the business logic nicely, get that tested, and first, and don't bother too much about the API call as such.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
The final category I put on here was control add-ins. To be honest, I haven't worked very much with control add-ins, and when I have, they've been pretty simple controls because we want something particular like a drag and drop control, or we want some capability of JavaScript that you can't replicate with AL code.
Yeah.
But again, that's beyond the scope of my testing at the moment.
And this one relates also to what I said. If it becomes technically too difficult, this is what we then will test manually at the moment. It's also a matter of priorities. Having a backlog on what you need to get done, that's one thing. As you talked with the team, and getting your team also more included in the way you or get them introduced in the way you are working. You have to make choices, and typically, let's say, aside maybe from API calls, I fully agree that there is priority on business logic and not on the full technical thing.
Yeah.
By the way, one side note, if I may, on the web service calls, of course, it's one of the reasons also not to do it is that you're loading another one's system, and you probably don't want to, next to the fact that you might be having to pay for each call. And very often, relating to pages, calling a web service is taking time. I was surprised to see in some of our code that somebody had set up nicely everything to be able to communicate with an external web service, and did a call, and that one took 16 seconds, which is way too big a waste of time in the context of test automation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Now, you've mentioned manual testing a few times, so that's another question I wanted to ask, and a question that we had as a group when I was doing the training. So I think we both agree with this statement. It's not the goal of automated testing to remove the need for manual testing.
Yeah, check.
We still want a business consultant in the web client using it in the way that a user is expected to use it and giving us feedback. So if that's the case, then what is the goal of automated testing and of manual testing? What's the boundary between the two? You got a view on that?
Yeah. First of all, I don't want manual testers to get bored and annoyed by repeating tasks. So everything that's actually well known, let's say, the bigger coverage of things that needs to be done is repeated, and especially now that we're getting more and more into this monthly update and having potentially to rerun everything, this is going to be tedious and also very costly. So as I call it, getting test automation, getting a good coverage is walking up a hill. First, you don't have anything, and every step you do is that you're at the next level. Let's say the first 100 meters up, and then the second 100, and because you're already up a certain stage, any manual tester can then start doing more interesting things, or the things we've never done before. So that's the basic story for me. So what we can automate and what is doable, having in mind the previous slide, and the time given, let's get things in place so that we enable our manual testers to get into real testing, and not having to do those stupid repeatable things. That's roughly my answer.
Yeah, I think it's a good answer. I might only add, I think our manual testers bring a lot that automated testing does not. So an automated test will not tell you, for instance, is this actually a nice user experience? Is it obvious to me which fields you are expecting me to fill in? Is it clear which actions I should be clicking on? Do they have captions that make sense to me?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that a human using the web client is going to give you that feedback in a way that automated tests can't. So all your tests may pass, but it might be a horrible user experience.
Yeah.
The fields are in the wrong order, or it's not at all clear what you're expecting the user to fill in, and that is really valuable feedback, which I think still only a human can give you that feedback.
Fully agree. I would, however, call this usability testing, and the other one, let's say, application testing, which of course they intertwine somehow. And you need that for sure. Of course, with telemetry, you get more and more information, or you can collect information on how people use pages and go through them, etc. That's also valuable things. But yes, let's say the application might be doing what it should be doing, and that's what I would call application testing. But it's just, as you said, horrible to be used to be used by an end user. True. Yeah. By the way, you triggered also a thought. As I mentioned, going up that hill or that mountain, manual testers can start at a higher level. And somebody mentioned one or pointed to a blog post where somebody called two things differently. Automated testing is actually automated checking. And what manual people do is what testing is, to make a difference. And testing needs human intelligence, human creativity, not just only to see whether it feels right, but also try to put a crowbar somewhere virtually in between and see if they can destabilize the system under test or not. And that's, I mean, if you set up automated test, you already know what it should be doing and should have been provided the system or enabled the system to do that in a stable way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now the next slide is about code coverage, and I've seen there's a question about that.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's useful to come back to that. Maybe we should switch to some of your slides.
Yeah, let's do that because code coverage is a bit a step aside. It's not telling anything about how you test or that you test, but the fact that you run some code and measure it. Of course, we'll discuss it related to automated test, but that's fine. Let me make myself presenter, so I'll be able to share my screen. Let me start sharing my screen, and of course let me also get to the right slide and not repeating things you've done. So what I'm going to talk about, and please step in also anybody with questions, but surely you too, James. So that should be this one. Yeah, I call this section here Test Plan at 4PS. Roughly, your approach is as I started or tried to describe it. You as a developer wants to get hold on the way you're developing and deliver a good quality code. You want to understand what you are going to do, and in essence, anybody as a developer, I think, wants to do that. I like your approach of sitting down, developing the one and the other next to the other. Of course, you have input from requirements, and that's where actually I more and more tended to start from anyway. At 4PS, having a very big solution, as far as I know, it's the biggest solution, ISV solution around the globe. It's humongous. It's what I call 2 Mount Everest high. A long way to go. And I started to step in from a requirements perspective. So I want to first have testers and developers. That's the main focus point or main roles in our development practice. We do have functional role, but it's a little bit outside of the team. So we need to get them included once in a while, but they're not, let's say, they're available on a daily practice. That's the history of the company, and it works quite nice. I'm sometimes a bit surprised still that it does, but it works quite nice. Testers, we have dedicated testers. They have been doing that job for years. Who am I to change that as such? But I want testers and developers to be responsible for the test they're going to need to validate the solution. Yes, so to understand the solution, as you put it, but at the same time to be able to show that this is the expected behavior. And I made a small animation here, which I will show after I introduce a couple of things. The reason why I joined 4PS is to leverage their test automation practice. They have been trying a couple of times, including some work with me a couple of years ago, but it, let's say, slowly started to sleep again, and next to all the other challenges, they had a hard time to put their shoulders under together and be focused on it. So I stepped into this, and yes, it's not called code coverage, but it's of course highly related to it, to get a greater coverage of test automation. They had some things way too little and doing still so much manually. And that's where what I also already mentioned, the tedious part of repeating manual tests, wanting to move into the cloud. We're not fully cloud yet. We do have cloud, but we have our own cloud. We have a customized base app, and it's our own rhythm for the updates. So roughly every quarter, but eventually we are also needed to be pushed into the Microsoft Cloud with the monthly update. Yeah. So we need test automation in plan. But why a test plan? For me, a test plan is to talk about, and it relates to what you said, but this is as I view it, but correct me, at a higher level as a group. This is a feature we're working on. How the heck are we going to validate this thing without even coding yet? Yeah, just as part of requirements, actually. So what set of tests will tell us that if we run them, that this is what is expected? Yeah, so that, of course, a lot of things are highly related, but we're sitting a bit at a higher level before we even get to coding to get this discussed. Yeah. So what is going to tell us that this is the wanted behavior? We have implemented something. And irrespective of whether we code them. So test plan has nothing to do with test automation. Test automation, more and more, as I put it, an open door maybe, is testing. Yeah. And yes, the tester and developer also discuss how much time do you have to do something. So can you code this part? Yes, or maybe a little bit more. How much time do you have as a manual tester? Would you be able to do that? So it's also a bit a time management part of the story. And what turned out, and actually was something I always have a bit of a hard time in explaining, as at least I feel like that, but it turned out exactly this way. I didn't tell many people at 4PS this part, but actually what you're doing with the test plan is that you're reviewing the requirements. If you're not able to set up tests, then the requirements probably are not clear enough. And of course, there is this agile part where requirements might evolve also while we're getting into it. But too often, as people found out, we have requirements that, let's put it positively, a little bit too agile. So the feedback was, even before they started to automate them, we have a tool, we have a kind of we're developing a skill where we have a better way of judging the quality of the requirements. Are we set to do something anyway well enough? Yeah. This is what tester and developers do together, high-level test plan. And I have one example. This is a very small one. This was a feature I had been working on. It's a connection to the Chamber of Commerce, Kamer van Koophandel in the Netherlands, where you can provide a registration number, send that to the service, and get let's say a full a collection of data on the address of and the name of the company this registration number belongs to, a whole bunch of information that is available in general to anybody from the Chamber of Commerce. So what did I do with the tester? And it was a small addition to an existing implementation. So we came up with 6 tests. Yeah, this is just planning the test. Apart from the phrasing, or whether it was exact enough or whatever, it is sitting down and high over. So, okay, is this what it is? The tester was more experienced. It was new to me. So a logical question for me would be 6 tests only. Eventually, we made more tests, but for this specific edition, those 6 tests sufficed. And there is this kind of thing. What we tend to do is that we try to group things. It relates to the contact. So on a contact card, are you able to do this? Eventually, you should be able to do this. And these are the 2 tests on a customer and on a vendor. Yeah, that's test plan. And of course, a simple one. I'm not allowed to share everything, but this I was allowed to share. Next to the fact that if you have a complex one, I would come up with an Excel sheet. I had to scroll through whatever. But this is a beginning. Not about any details, although we make some notes here maybe, but it's not telling me anything about what is the expected outcome exactly. It's not telling me what is the data setup I need to do, but it's just saying this is what we need to test. We need to enter that registration number. We need to get that information actually from, that's the get. I change it later to some 2 different terms, and then eventually getting the data into BC. It should be transferred into the contact card or the contact record or the customer, whatever. Yeah. So that's what they do, and that's what we call a test plan breakdown. Break it down into areas so that for each area you could have tests created. I also tell them more and more, if that's too difficult for you, too high over, and you just sit down and you're able to just brainstorm on tests, put them on the table, just start from the bottom up. So define tests and then maybe start to group them. The advantage of grouping them is that you will, and this one is very obvious, but you will recognize more and more repeatable or repeated patterns. Oh, in this group, this set of tests, yes. Actually, one basic test and the rest are variations. So you already see as a developer something like, okay, probably if I build one test, the other 5 are an easy peasy. They're just variations. It gives you more and more confidence on be able to achieve this. Make sense so far?
Yeah, it does. And I'm wondering if this is leading towards answering Peter's question, which was the question I often get from business consultants is, how can I see what the automated tests test? They're only seeing the code unit and method names. And I think what you're describing is a more collaborative process between the business consultants and the developers in the first place define tests.
Yeah, I think you tackled Peter's question very nicely in this way. It's a team effort, and it shouldn't be something like I'm handing it over to you and you do some magic with it and then tell me that everything works. In this example, and let me jump in this case to a code part here. this is having much more than those 6 tests. But eventually, and those who know me somehow, and Peter does, but I reckon some other names being present also, setting up this given when then, as you also mentioned, is a functional description of a behavior. And the team should know about this one. My ideal is that the functional consultant should come up with given when then also. I'm not saying it eventually is the easiest way or is achievable, but everybody should be included. So it should not be like handing off some requirements and it's your abacadabra and telling them that it's working. And they think, well, it looks okay, but I'm not very confident because I don't know what's happening behind. The reason that I write code like this, and it's in that sense, your code was a little bit more the real code in your test. I try to stay away from that part as much as possible. So the real code you will find here implemented to be able to sit down with my tester, who's not a technical person, or my functional consultant colleague, that I can discuss this with them and show them, yes, these are the steps that we came up with. And before I get here, and that's one step in between that I would like to show you, is that actually we get from the test description, what I call a test planning, into the test designing, the details, and anybody of the team actively related, included in the team, should be reviewing this. Yeah? And if let me show you this one, maybe that makes it at the moment a better step, but okay, now it's somewhere hidden behind. Oh, do I get that in view for myself to open it up? I'm a bit fighting with the GoToWebinar control here. So this is the implementation, or let's say the planning and designing of my test. So I changed the wording a little bit, but these are the 6 tests you just saw in the original test plan. And this is what is made up before we even start coding. Yeah. And this tells me, what do you need in your system? Yeah, like you said, an empty database. I want to be knowing what data I need to be able to eventually call upon that service. By the way, we mimic that one, we mock that one, so we don't call the service, but we make sure that it triggers the business logic. And then the things that we need to validate. Yeah. And yes, the corporation part is functional technical here. This is not a technical story. This is a functional story which needs to be eventually implemented technically. I hope that answers Peter's question well enough. He made up some, agreed, but sometimes you need to revisit a test created 2 years ago and some of the people have moved. True. We always save the information, but an improvement in that area would be welcome. Mm-hmm.
And possibly, is this the goal of your what's it called now, ATDD test scripter extension?
Yeah.
Was that?
Yeah, true.
Was it requirement?
Well, the thing, of course, is eventually what we test is behavior. Right? It's not a conceptual testing. We can't test the concept of a requirement. We eventually need to define what the behavior is. And there is a hole between those two. So if I don't know if Peter means that way, but yes, from a conceptual perspective, your tests are not a one-to-one mapping. Yeah, so or you cannot map it backwards again. On the other hand, it's exactly telling, if I do this, the system will react like this. If I do that, the system will react like that. Yeah, so for me, yes, knowing the hole between the conceptual description and this part, that might be a challenge. On the other hand, this is the only up-to-date, eventually the implementation, the only up-to-date documentation. And with the test scripter, there are 2 levels, indeed. Some might have seen it. I can pick up a scenario and put that into a PowerShell description, because these are aliases for commandlets. And I can convert this one and that's what we use already, into this code unit based upon that Excel sheet. Yeah. So here, that's one way, and there's not a full circle yet, but as like with you, tests do fail, or test parts do fail, and you're going to implement step by step so you get closer to a successful test. Yeah. And this is based upon the fact I, as a developer, more or less could be, I need to want to understand it also, but it could be like, I get this from that sheet, I'll put this so that the code structure is built up, and I can just start programming on the parts of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's quite some questions coming in. Shall we have a look at the questions maybe? Well, you do already, but let's tackle them also more.
Yeah, so I would like to get onto code coverage a little bit.
Yeah. So let's do that then.
Shall I start just with my perspective of code coverage? Maybe you can scan the questions.
Yeah, I'll make you presenter. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'll just throw up this slide. Because I think for me, it's important to realize what code coverage is not good for, as well as what it is good for. So personally, I would definitely avoid trying to agree on a target, whatever that would be, 75%, 80%, because this is a succinct summary of the problem, I think. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. As soon as you say, right, everyone, our target is 80% code coverage, your developers will find a way to make sure the code coverage is 80%. And it might be just by adding meaningless tests, or you can condense your functions into fewer lines of code if you want a greater percentage of them to be covered. I think a target doesn't incentivize the behavior in us as developers. So I personally would warn against doing that. And also, code coverage does not tell you anything about whether those tests are any good or not. So again, that's where what you're describing is useful. What are the given when thens? What is the expected behavior that we are testing? And that collaboration between the functional requirements and the consultants and to make sure we're actually testing the right things, and these are good tests, not just tests that happen to hit the majority of our code. And also, just because you get to 100%, if you ever do get to 100%, which is probably but if you do have 100%, that doesn't mean all the important different paths through the code are covered. Yeah. So that, just a few cautions against how to interpret the headline figure. But let me show you. So if I run my test here, you can enable code coverage. There's a setting in my extension. You can also do this in the test tool in the client. But enable code coverage is an option here, and it will use the test runner service app, publish that into your container if you don't already have that. So this is going to run all of my tests, my 8 tests that I have here. And when it's finished, we'll give a summary of the code coverage. So here we go, only 2 objects in this case. The way I would interpret this is I'd scan down the objects and see, well, 25% is low. I'll go and look at this object, this customer table extension. Why is our code coverage low? You can toggle down the bottom right here, displaying which lines have been hit by your test. It toggles between off what was hit in the previous test run and what was hit the last time you ran all of the tests. That's why there's 3 options there. So any lines which are not highlighted have not been hit by any of my tests.
Yeah.
So I would use, or actually maybe this update on open documents, that's quite an important function. We really ought to have a test for that. And I can go back and fill in the gaps. Or I might decide if this is related to HTTP client, which I've decided I'm not going to test, or it's code on a page or a report. Again, I typically wouldn't attempt to test reports in automated tests. So I'm using that as more of a guide to myself. Are there important gaps in my test coverage that I ought to be filling?
Yeah. Yeah, and then that's a functional level again. As you said, if you have 100% coverage, you might still miss a number of code flows, because touched all the code, but not all the variants of the different decision trees have been run through, and you might still miss essential scenarios.
And the first question from Arthur, I think you've got some insight on about making code coverage on a pull request. Tests.
There are some discussions going on, and like ALOps provided by Waldo's team, but also Microsoft has a couple of things. The thing is, of course, that you made it possible here to have a look at previous run and the current run and everything. It's code coverage is could be a helpful tool if you're able in your pull request to compare with the previous run of your tests. So that something we're going to work on, nothing set yet in our company, and at 4PS at least, that we would like to have code coverage stable. So any next pull request should not diminish the code coverage percentage, because that means you probably have been adding new lines of code, but not related tests, which means that now the number of lines of code is a lower percentage covered by your tests. So that's something still be worked on. And I know, if I recall right, Arthur, you were on one thread in for ALOps also, where Waldo asked us, so what would be typically your measure of doing it? It's something which is under, for my part, for sure, under investigation. But at the moment, not the highest priority, unfortunately. Let's say our code coverage is so low that we might not even measure the difference at the moment. But it's surely something that needs attention. But be aware, and I really like that you mentioned it also, James. Code coverage is well, you didn't mention the word like that, but it's not a holy grail. It's you need to know what the relevance of it is. It's not an absolute figure. If you have 90% coverage, that you're safe or whatever. You might still be missing very essential scenarios.
Yeah, and also if you already have, like you described at 4PS, if you already have a big legacy code base and you're getting started with automated testing, you have to decide, where am I best to focus my efforts? Should I go through my existing code base and try to achieve 80–90% code coverage? And my answer to that question is, automated testing is all about confidence. I want the tests to give me confidence that the code works in the way that it's supposed to, and that I haven't introduced any regression bugs. Now, if I'm already confident that the code I have from years ago does work, because we've been selling it to customers for years and we know it's pretty stable, I would question, how worthwhile is it to go back and prioritize writing automated tests for that legacy code?
Yeah.
Definitely for new code. And sure, if you've got developers twiddling their thumbs looking for work to do, by all means, get them to fill in the gaps in the legacy code. But I think that's not a problem most developers have. I think we need to prioritize how we use our development time.
Yeah, true. By the way, we're stealing a little bit of your time wrapping this up. At Microsoft, they also say we're not focusing on hiring the bar on existing code. It's working, and yes, if we run into issues, bug fixing, etc., we provide additional tests. But for the rest, that's what it is. We focus on new functionality. At 4PS, we are focusing on existing functionality because we have a very low coverage. And yes, we have testers having to need to manually rerun tests on existing functionality just to do, you could say, in a way, spot checking, do a regression test on that. And that's what we want to be more efficient on by providing automated tests. But it's not, the major goal is not like we need to cover all our existing code. Surely not.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at the question. There was a question from Martijn van Spanje about is it possible to create an automated test to check the running time of a specific test? For example, if it runs more than 500 milliseconds, the test will fail. That's not the focus of this kind of automated testing. There you should be doing, that's more of performance testing. So a test fails because of it doesn't achieve its goal. And the goal with this test is not time-wise or whatever. You can, in the test tool, look at how long it takes. And as you can see in the screen of James, you see at the bottom in the output that there is a time measure put there. So you could have an eye on that, but that's not the goal of this testing. This is application testing, A in, B out. And whether it takes an hour or 20 seconds or milliseconds, that's not part of this testing, although it would be very dramatic if that takes that long. Yeah. And there was a question from Gert. What about a feedback loop from TDD? Back to functional consultant, discuss the TDD test, not top down, but bottom up, and come with TDD to a TDD. So if I read it right, Gert, and James also please step in, TDD is actually a big technical exercise where you're more close to testing an API, and an API could be a code unit containing your business logic, not just being a web service kind of thing, but anything that you can address from a certain level, which you could say is also functional. But TDD tends to be more at a lower level to test the different components, whether they work right, while ATD is more about getting at the level of functional, already a bit in integration. I'm doing this process like the origin, the example of James. And yes, if that works fine for you to do it first at the component and then at a higher level, please do so. I don't have any pointers to do it that way. My focus is mostly ATDD because of we're good at already at functional testing. Our functional people do that. We're not as good in our world in general, in our BC world, at doing that at a technical level. But that's my opinion. I don't know what you have to say to that, James.
Yeah, I don't know if this is quite the point of the question, but part of the reason I like to work in an empty company is it removes as many of my assumptions as possible. So let's say a location can be set up with or without warehouse shipments, or with inventory picks, or with warehouse picks. And if I'm going to write a test that involves creating a shipment and shipping and invoicing a sales order, then I'm not going to rely on an existing blue or white or whatever location. I'm going to create that location in my test, and often writing the test and using the library functions to create the master data is then the moment I realize, I need some clarification here. Are we using warehouse shipments? Are we using inventory picks? Are we using both? Or maybe some things are out of scope deliberately, and in which case, let's agree what's in scope and out of scope. I don't know if that's quite what you're getting at, but yeah, that is quite a common sort of bottom-up experience that I have, to pardon the phrase. Yeah, going back to the requirements because it's not clear what the test should do.
I think altogether we gave some answer that makes sense. And yes, we have this different approach of being more on the bottom side, getting your code well in place, and here is where James, in my opinion, James, you pick up using your experience, pushing back on the requirements while you are coding. And my approach is a little bit higher up, enabling people in the team to push back on the requirements just because of I don't want them to step into the potential pitfall of getting to code things, and then the functional consultants is not ready available, and then getting discussion at that level while already planned to get things delivered tomorrow or next week. But if we do it up front, nothing is planned set yet, and if they understand, then we're going to get into the planning. Hope that makes sense a bit. Let's have an eye on time. It was an update of us both, James, you and me, and I hope we updated the other people also. I wanted to share this last slide here, and we're going to wrap up. We passed the time already. This slide here. So thank you very much, James, for updating me on this, and I hope everybody else present also. If there's any follow-up, please send us questions if you have more. And well, maybe James, in 3 months' time, we need the next update, whatever. I really love this conversation, and I hope maybe anybody else is also enthused to step in and give an update on what they are doing in their company with test automation. So this is an invitation to step in and sit down with me and James, or with James or me, or whomever. So shall we close down?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Luc.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording. Have a good evening, good night, whatever time of the day you're at. And let's get together in 2 weeks' time with David Singleton also. See you later.